Everything you've been told about how America treats its veterans is based on one generation, and that generation was the exception, not the rule. The World War II homecoming, the parade, the GI Bill, the suburb, the job, that wasn't the standard. That was a moment. And when the next war ended, the country quietly decided the moment was over and didn't tell the men coming home. The man came home on a Tuesday. No one met him at the airport. He had flown commercial from the West Coast, still in uniform, his duffel bag jammed under the seat in front of him. By the time he landed, the terminal was mostly empty. He changed clothes in the bathroom before he went outside. He had been advised to. He took a cab. His father had come home differently. His father had come home in 1945 to a city that had spent 3 days putting up bunting. There had been a band. There had been a crowd so thick you couldn't see the pavement. His mother had cried at the train station. The neighbors had put a sign in the window that said, "Welcome home," 2 weeks before he arrived, so everyone who walked past knew who was coming back and why it mattered. The gap between the father's return and the son's is not a footnote. It is the hinge on which the social contract between this country and its veterans came apart. The welcome home for World War II veterans was not spontaneous. It was organized, anticipated, and institutionalized long before the last shot was fired. Cities had committees, newspapers had plans, employers had legal obligations. New York City's victory celebration on August 14, 1945, drew an estimated 2 million people into Lower Manhattan in a single afternoon. Local papers had run photographs of returning servicemen for days, putting names to faces. You didn't just know soldiers were coming home. You knew which soldiers. You knew their mothers. You knew what street they lived on. That specificity mattered. It was the visible enactment of an agreement that the sacrifice had been collective, that the return was collective, and that the community was responsible for the man who had gone. The first broken promise, the homecoming. The men who served in Vietnam did not come home the way their fathers had. They came home individually. The military policy governing return from Vietnam was built around DROS, the date eligible for return from overseas, a system that assigned each soldier a personal rotation date, regardless of what his unit was doing. You served your 365 days, you left. The men you had fought beside stayed. You flew home alone on a commercial aircraft, frequently with no other veterans aboard, from a country at war to a country at peace, in a transition that took less than 48 hours. Unit cohesion is one of the primary mechanisms by which human beings process shared trauma. The World War II veteran who came home on a troop ship with 500 men from his unit came home in a community of comprehension. The Vietnam veteran who landed at Oakland Army Base at 2 in the morning came home into a silence that had no equivalent in the previous American military experience. The second broken promise, the welcome itself. No national parade was held for Vietnam veterans when the war ended. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973. There was no ceremony, no organized homecoming, no formal public acknowledgement at a national scale. The first national welcome home parade for Vietnam veterans did not occur until June 1986 in Chicago, more than a decade after the war's end. Approximately 200,000 veterans attended. Many of them wept. Some had never told their neighbors they had served. The parade was not late in the way a flight is late. It was late in the way a funeral is late, after the grief has already calcified into something harder and less accessible. In the years between, the advice military officials had passed along informally, change out of your uniform before you go through the terminal, became part of the cultural memory of the era. Whether every Vietnam veteran was spat upon is something historians have debated. What is not difficult to verify is the fear, the expectation, the sense reported consistently that the uniform was a liability rather than a symbol of service.
The third broken promise, the GI Bill. On June 22, 1944, President Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. What it did, in practice, was construct a floor beneath the returning veteran's life, a set of guaranteed minimums that made economic failure almost structurally difficult for a man willing to use them. The education benefits alone sent nearly 8 million veterans through college or vocational training by 1956. The bill transformed who higher education was for and what kind of life a man without family money could reasonably expect to build. 45,000 engineers came out of it, 238,000 teachers, 91,000 scientists, 67,000 doctors. The housing provision reshaped the landscape more visibly than anything else. GI Bill home loans required no down payment. By 1955, more than 4.3 million home loans had been backed under the bill. When William Levitt began building houses on a Long Island potato farm in 1947, the houses sold for $7,990. A factory worker on a decent union wage could cover the monthly payment and still have money left over. The Vietnam-era Veterans Readjustment Benefits Act of 1966 existed and provided education benefits, but the comparison is instructive. The education stipend for a full-time student was $100 a month in 1966. By 2010, adjusted for inflation, that $100 had the purchasing power of roughly $82. College tuition had been rising throughout the 1960s as universities expanded. The benefit was running a losing race against the cost of the thing it was meant to fund. Veterans who went to VA offices in the late 1960s and early 1970s frequently reported understaffed counters, confusing paperwork, and a system that seemed designed to discourage rather than facilitate. The difference in navigating that system was not simply administrative. It was a message, communicated through friction, about how much the country valued the claim being made, the fourth broken promise, housing, and the fifth, who it was built for. The men who came home from World War II stepped into a housing market essentially being built for them in real time. Levittown opened in 1947 and sold out almost immediately. The houses were 800 square feet, 2 bedrooms, but new, affordable, and surrounded by families in the same position. The suburb was a community built from scratch by a generation that had come home together. Vietnam veterans came home to a housing landscape already divided. The suburbs had stratified. Getting in required more money than the previous generation had needed, and the community inside wasn't built around a shared moment of return. But the World War II standard requires honesty about what it actually was. The original GI Bill built the American middle class, largely white. The deed restrictions written into Levittown's original contracts explicitly prohibited resale to black families. FHA loan guarantees were administered through local banks that routinely refused to lend in black neighborhoods. The VA home loan guarantee was theoretically race-neutral. Its implementation was not. Black World War II veterans returned to a country that had drafted them equally and rewarded them unequally. Black Vietnam veterans came home to a country that had used them heavily in combat. They represented a disproportionate share of frontline infantry units in the early years, and that had given their fathers a diminished version of the promise it made to white veterans. They weren't simply heirs to a weakened GI Bill. They were heirs to a version that had largely excluded people who looked like them from its most transformative benefits, the sixth broken promise, employment. The employment portion of the World War II contract had teeth. The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 required employers to rehire returning veterans in their previous jobs. This was not a suggestion, it was law. The Veterans Preference Act gave veterans additional points on federal civil service examinations. The unemployment rate among World War II veterans by 1947 was under 3%, essentially full employment. The unemployment rate among Vietnam veterans hit 11% in 1974. The national rate for the same year was roughly 5.5%. The veteran was not simply caught in a bad economy, he was doing worse in it than his civilian peers. A 1977 Congressional Budget Office report found that Vietnam veterans earned between 15 and 19% less than non-veteran peers of equivalent age and education. A 1971 Lewis Harris poll found that a significant segment of employers associated Vietnam veterans with drug use, psychological instability, and potential workplace problems. The concern was not entirely baseless. The military's own 1971 study estimated that 10 to 15% of soldiers in country had used heroin, but it was applied broadly to a population of men who had, the large majority of them, served without incident and come home ready to work. The stereotype became a filter.
The seventh broken promise: civic infrastructure. The WWII generation had the highest rates of civic participation in modern American history. Church attendance, union membership, bowling leagues, PTA chapters, volunteer fire departments. The generation that had fought the war built an extraordinary density of communal life in the 1950s and early 1960s. The American Legion had 3.3 million members by 1946. A man who came home from the Pacific and went to his Legion post found employment referrals, legal help with GI Bill paperwork, informal counseling from men who understood what he had seen, and a community that functioned, however imperfectly, as a mental health buffer. The Vietnam veteran who tried to walk into that structure found something different. The culture inside the Legion posts and VFW halls was built around a different war and a different homecoming, and many Vietnam veterans reported feeling unwelcome, not universally, but consistently enough to register as a pattern. Vietnam Veterans of America was founded in 1978 to address this gap. Its founder, Bobby Muller, had been shot through the chest in 1969 and paralyzed. He had spent years navigating a VA system that was, among other things, unable to provide him with a properly fitted wheelchair for an extended period. That detail, a paralyzed veteran of the United States military, unable to get adequate equipment from the agency charged with his care, is a small thing in one sense. In another, it is the entire argument in a single image. The eighth broken promise, VA healthcare, and the ninth, Agent Orange. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders until the third edition, published in 1980. The war in Vietnam ended in April 1975. That means there was a 5-year period wherein the men who came home were experiencing a condition that did not exist in the official medical taxonomy. They could not be diagnosed with it. The VA could not recognize it as service-connected. What happened instead was that the symptoms of undiagnosed PTSD were interpreted through other frameworks: irritability, hypervigilance, nightmares, difficulty holding jobs, troubled marriages, alcohol and drug use. These were read as character failures. A veteran who lost his temper was not understood as someone whose nervous system had been reconfigured by prolonged exposure to life-threatening violence. He was understood as someone who could not control himself. Veterans were arrested. Veterans were jailed. Veterans lost custody of their children, all for manifestations of a condition that, had it been recognized, would have been understood as a predictable outcome of what the country had asked them to do. The National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, published in 1988, found that approximately 30% of Vietnam combat veterans, nearly 1 in 3 men who had seen sustained combat, met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. Between 1962 and 1971, the U.S. military sprayed approximately 19 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnam. The most widely used was Agent Orange. Its active contaminant, TCDD dioxin, is associated with multiple cancers,
type 2 diabetes, neurological disorders, Parkinson's disease, and birth defects in the children and grandchildren of those exposed. The VA refused to acknowledge Agent Orange exposure as a service-connected cause of illness for most conditions until the 1990s. The Agent Orange Act was not passed until 1991, 2 decades after the last spraying operations ended, and a generation after the first veterans began reporting cancers and birth defects. Some were dead by the time the acknowledgement came. The burden of proof was placed on the sick man, not on the agency that had ordered him to be there. The 10th broken promise: who was asked to carry it? The average age of the American combat soldier in World War II was 26. He had lived some portion of adult life before the war. He had held jobs. He had developed relationships. He had a sense of personal identity that existed independently of his military service. The average age of the American combat soldier in Vietnam was 19. His adult identity had been formed almost entirely by his military experience. He had no prior civilian career to return to. His peers at home had spent those years in college, or starting jobs, or developing social relationships. He came back to find himself behind, not just economically, but developmentally. The WW2 veteran had the benefit of weeks at sea during which decompression could at least begin. The Vietnam veteran had 36 hours on a commercial aircraft, no unit around him, and a cultural reception that ranged from hostile to simply absent. He was 19 years old, and there was nothing waiting for him that adequately acknowledged any of that. The 11th broken promise: the economy that was supposed to hold. The economy that World War II veterans had built, the union jobs, the manufacturing wages, the company pensions, the middle-class stability available to a man without a college degree, was already showing stress fractures by the mid-1960s. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo caused gas prices to more than double in weeks. Inflation hit 11% annually by 1974. Stagflation arrived as a new fact of American economic life precisely as veterans were trying to find their footing. The factory job that had been a reliable middle-class path for the previous generation was beginning to face automation pressure. The union contracts that had guaranteed wages and benefits were in the early stages of what would become a decades-long decline. The company pension was being replaced by systems that placed investment risk on the worker. None of this was the veteran's fault, but it landed on him at a moment when he was least equipped to absorb it. Young, without accumulated savings, often without a college degree, in many cases carrying psychological injuries that made stable employment harder to establish and maintain. The 12th broken promise: public trust in the war. The WW2 veteran came home from a war that had the support of virtually every sector of American society. The mobilization had been total. The cause had been understood as existential. The Vietnam veteran came home from a war that by 1971 had the support of 28% of the American public. Roughly 3 out of 4 Americans believed the war had been wrong, or mismanaged, or both. The veteran had not chosen the war. He had been drafted in most cases, or had enlisted in a context where service felt obligatory. He had done what the country asked, but the country had largely decided that what it had asked was a mistake. The Winter Soldier hearings of 1971, at which veterans testified about atrocities they had witnessed or participated in, added to a cultural image that was morally complicated. My Lai, carried out in March 1968 and reported publicly in November 1969, had placed the face of a war crime on the American soldier. This did not mean that most Vietnam veterans had committed atrocities. It meant that the cultural framework through which they were received had been shaped by the most extreme examples of what the war produced. The 14th broken promise: being believed. The WW2 veteran who reported a service-connected injury was operating in an institutional environment built on the assumption that his claim was probably true. The cultural presumption was that the veteran had served faithfully and deserved the benefit of the doubt. The Vietnam veteran who walked into a VA office in 1972 or 1976 or 1981 was operating in an entirely different environment. The VA was under-resourced. Its claims process was adversarial in structure, requiring the veteran to prove what the government was inclined to dispute. The experience of going to the agency charged with your care and being treated as someone whose account of his own body requires legal-grade proof before it can be accepted is a specific kind of institutional violence. It communicates something precise about how much the contract is worth.
The 15th broken promise, permission to decompress. The original GI Bill included an unemployment provision known informally as the 5220 Club. It paid $20 a week, roughly a week's wages for a factory worker, for up to 52 weeks. This was not generous. It was meant to be a buffer, a decompression period during which a man could take stock, grieve what he needed to grieve, figure out what he was going to do next, and do it without the pressure of immediate financial desperation. The concept embedded in that provision was significant. The transition from soldier to civilian is not instantaneous, and the country has an obligation to hold space for it. The Vietnam-era equivalent had been so eroded by inflation and complicated by bureaucratic process that it functioned poorly. Beyond that, the culture offered no equivalent informal permission. He was expected to get on with it. Adjustment was his problem, a sign of weakness, rather than a predictable response to extraordinary circumstances. The space the previous generation had been offered did not exist for him. The 16th through 20th broken promises. The 16th was the handshake, the neighbor who says without irony that you did a hard thing and you did it for us and we know it. World War II veterans received this in both formal and informal forms. Vietnam veterans received, in many cases, nothing. Not hostility, just absence. The absence of ceremony, the absence of acknowledgement, the absence of the moment that says, we sent you and you went, and what you went through was on our behalf. The 17th was generational. The World War II veterans who built the Legion posts in suburban neighborhoods and union halls were not deliberately indifferent to their sons' experience. They had built the best country they knew how to build. The problem was that the country they built was designed around their specific experience of service, and it was not equipped to accommodate an experience that was different in nearly every dimension. There are accounts, consistent enough to carry weight, of Legion posts where Vietnam veterans who tried to talk about what they had seen were told, directly or by cultural implication, that their war did not compare. The generational fracture was not simply between veterans and the counterculture. It was between veterans, and that was, in some ways, the most isolating of all. The 18th was the institutional advocacy failure. The American Legion had been one of the most effective advocacy organizations in the country after World War II, lobbying for the GI Bill, for VA expansion, for veterans' preference in federal hiring. There are documented instances of the American Legion lobbying against strengthening the Vietnam-era GI Bill on grounds of cost and institutional priority. The organization that should have been the Vietnam veterans' most powerful ally was not fighting for him. Bobby Muller had to build a new organization from a wheelchair because the existing ones were insufficient. The 19th was the economy those veterans had been told they were defending. They came home to find it entering a long period of stress. The oil shock of 1973, the stagflation of 1974, the industrial decline accelerating through the late 1970s. All of this arrived as Vietnam veterans were trying to get their footing. The man had been told he was preserving the American way of life.
He came home to find the American way of life changing in ways that would take him further from it with each passing decade. The 20th was the simplest and the most enduring. It was the promise that service means something, that the country knows what it asked of you, that the years you gave and the things you saw and the person you were before you went and the person you became after are held in a collective understanding that gives them weight beyond your own private accounting, that you are not alone with what happened to you. The World War II veteran received that promise more fully than any generation of American veterans before or since. The aggregate message was coherent. You went, you served, you belong here. Here is what we owe you. Here is the country we are building together. The Vietnam veteran received a fractured and diminished version of that message, arriving years late, in pieces, through institutions that were overextended and a culture that was unsure what to do with him. The corrections came eventually. The wall was dedicated in November 1982, and the outpouring of public emotion at that dedication was evidence of how much had been withheld for how long. The Agent Orange Act of 1991 finally compelled the government to acknowledge what it had done to the men it had sent into those fields. The post-9/11 GI Bill, passed in 2008, substantially restored the robust benefit structure the 1944 bill had established. But the period between the service and the correction, measured in years of unemployment, years of untreated psychological injury, years of fighting the VA for benefits while cancer progressed, years of changing out of the uniform before entering the terminal, that gap is not retrievable. The men who needed the contract honored in 1972 needed it in 1972. The wall in Washington bears the names of 58,280 Americans who did not come home at all. The men whose names are not on it, who did come home, who navigated what was waiting for them with whatever they had, their accounting with the country that sent them has never been fully settled. Most of them would not say it in those terms. Most of them mean something more complicated than fine. That gap between what they were owed and what they received is the distance between one homecoming and another, between a brass band on a pier in 1945 and a cab ride alone at 2 in the morning 30 years later. It is the distance between a country that knew what it had asked and a country that had decided to look away. The men who were 19 years old in that jungle are in their mid-70s now. The country is still, in ways it does not always acknowledge, figuring out what it owes.